6 pulse lances were aimed at 800 kilos of death, and the only thing standing between them was a human with her hands up. Behind her, the creature filled the corridor. 800 kilos of gray-black plate and 6 thick limbs pressed flat to the floor, its chest cycling a color Sen had only ever seen in a footnote. Kethsoran Orbital Academy's searing had not been built for this. The walls were beige. The lighting was standard issue. The emergency strips along the floor had gone red 14 minutes ago, and they were still going. The grid voice came through the intercom. Calm, institutional, the same voice that announced meal rotations and shuttle departures. Lethal resolution protocol, 14 seconds. The human did not move. 10 seconds. No warning shot. No final announcement. No mercy protocol. 5. The turrets at the far end of the corridor were live. Sen could see the charge indicators from where she was crouched behind the emergency panel, 2 green dots in the dark, steady as stars. The lances were raised. Subcommander On's fist was closed at his shoulder, the hold signal and his team was holding, and the grid was still counting, and the creature behind the human had risen to its full height, and its plates had gone deep and slow, and 0. Silence. The turrets did not fire. 4 hours earlier, the atrium of Kethsoran Orbital Academy smelled like cut fiber and ozone from 11 council banners, running on their magnetic mounts at the same time. Sen Olive stood near the back of the crowd in her first-year dress uniform, skin a steady cream, and tried to see past the Kreshari delegates in front of her, who were tall and tended to arrange themselves in clusters. The ceremony was the most-watched orbital event in 53 years, 40 million live viewers on the broadcast feed. Carol, the Academy's Orvathi director, stood at the center podium in formal collar frame, his secondary arm folded behind him in the posture of institutional gravity. His collar ridge nodes were bright, high cognitive engagement, visible even from the back of the atrium. This was, the commentators had been saying for a week, a moment of historic alignment. 40 million people watching 11 species stand in the same room and agree on something. Sen adjusted her earpiece and tried to feel the weight of that. She mostly felt her feet. Tov Serath was not in the atrium. Sen would find this out later from the station log timestamp, 8:51. While Carol was giving the opening address, Tov Serath was in Searing with a printed transit schedule and a foil-wrapped ration bar, trying to find the correct junction for the shuttle bay. She had registered for a xenobiology symposium on Veth Station 3 weeks ago, in a moment of professional optimism, and she had been regretting it since. The ration bar had a caloric stamp in the upper left corner and an Academy supply code she had memorized without meaning to, because she had been holding it for 20 minutes. She had not eaten it. She was looking for Bay 7 connector when the containment alarm fired at 9:14. The sound was not like other alarms. Sen had heard fire warnings and pressure alerts and the soft triple tone of an administrative override. This was different. This was a sound like tearing metal threaded through the station rings. Low at first, then sudden, the kind of sound that made you check your own hands to make sure they were still attached. The atrium crowd went quiet. On the broadcast feed, 40 million people heard it too. Searing corridor ran between the research bays and the secondary transit hub, all beige panels and recessed lighting, and nothing that had ever been expected to matter. Sen had been cutting through it because the atrium was crowded and her feet hurt, and she had a practicum report due the next morning that she had not started. She had been 3 meters from the emergency panel when the alarm fired. She was behind it now. The panel was a maintenance access point, half a meter of reinforced composite, the kind of thing designed to protect crew from pressure events and nothing else. Sen had pressed herself into the alcove on instinct, and she had not moved since. Her earpiece had auto-switched to the security channel when the alarm class registered. She could hear On's team coordinating in short, clipped bursts. She could also hear the Vokai. She had not known what a Vokai sounded like before this morning. She knew now. It was a low sound, mostly below the range of easy hearing, more felt than heard, a vibration that moved through the floor and up through her boots and into her sternum. Every few seconds it shifted pitch. Her skin had gone white the moment the alarm fired and had not moved since. The intercom ran the standard containment advisory, Category 9.2 specimen. Searing, Section 4, personnel are advised to shelter in place. Lethal resolution protocol active. Grid time, 14 minutes. Category 9.2. Sen knew what that meant. She was a first-year xenobiology cadet, and the taxonomy was one of the first things they had made her memorize. Category 9 was reserved for specimens with confirmed fatality records and no established de-escalation pathway. The .2 modifier meant the specimen had demonstrated tactical behavior. Not just aggression, not just size, but coordination. The Volkai had been in the research bays for 31 days. The behavioral log running on her earpiece feed described the last 31 days as progressive agitation. The entries were clinical and consistent. Increased pacing, plate cycling duration extended, vocalization frequency up 14% week over week. The duty researcher had flagged it twice. On's team had reviewed the footage and confirmed the assessment. Progressive agitation. Standard pre-escalation profile. The Volkai had walked past 12 personnel in the research wing since the containment alarm fired. Not one of them had been touched. Sen noticed this. She filed it somewhere in the back of her mind where it sat, unresolved, while she pressed her back against the composite panel and watched the corridor. Tove Serath came around the junction at the wrong moment. Later, the timestamp would show she had been 40 meters from Bay 7 connector when the alarm fired. She had stopped walking. She had stood in the corridor for 11 seconds. The security feed caught it later, and the pause would get replayed a great many times. And then she had started walking again, but not toward the shuttle bay. Toward the sound. Sen saw her before On's team did. A human woman, mid-40s maybe, with the kind of stillness in her posture that didn't look like fear and didn't look like bravery either. It looked like attention. She was wearing a standard-issue civilian day jacket, and she was still holding the ration bar. She came around the bend and stopped, and the Volkai was 10 meters in front of her. 800 kilos, 6 limbs, sensor plates along the jaw that could read a heartbeat through solid rock, plates cycling amber along the chest, the color of a warning light, not a hunting display, but Sen knew from the taxonomy that the difference was measured in seconds. Tove looked at the Volkai for a long moment. Then she crouched, not fast, not slow. The specific, deliberate weight shift of someone who had done this before, who had decided that the position of her body mattered more than any other variable in the room. She went down to one knee, then both knees, and then she sat, cross-legged, on the beige floor of Searing. And she looked at the creature in front of her, and she did not move. The Volkai's amber cycling slowed. On's team came around the far bend 30 seconds later. 6 Rithian officers, full containment armor, lances raised, formation tight. Sen had seen Rithian containment teams in training footage. They moved like one organism, each position exactly where it should be, each lance vector calculated, nothing wasted. They were good at this. They had done it before. On himself was at the point. Sub-commander, 22 years of field work, the kind of calm that came from having done difficult things enough times that the adrenaline had worn grooves in him. He assessed the corridor in under 2 seconds. Lance vectors, scatter calculation, target mass, exit points. He registered the human sitting on the floor, and his assessment paused. "Ma'am," his voice was flat and procedural. "You need to move to the shelter points. There are arrows on the floor." Tove did not look at him. "I heard you," she said. She was still looking at the Volkai. No alarm in the behavioral log. No alert from the motion sensors. No flag on the pattern. This was what Sen would think about later, going back through the archived entries. 31 days of the Volkai pacing the same 4.2-meter stretch of the research bay, and what the duty researchers had logged as agitation had a different shape when you looked at the raw data. The pacing wasn't random. The timing wasn't random. The intervals between the low-frequency vocalizations, the ones below standard hearing range, the ones that only showed up as noise on the environmental sensors, had been consistent for 6 days. Not random noise, intervals, like something tapping a pattern on a door. Nobody had run the query. The behavioral log said progressive agitation, and everybody read progressive agitation, and the query never got run. Tove had been sitting on the floor for 90 seconds when she did the thing with the ration bar. She set it on the floor in front of her. Not thrown, not pushed, set down, the way you'd put something on a table to show you weren't hiding it. The foil caught the emergency strip red and threw a small flash of light. She slid it 3 inches forward. Then she put her hand back in her lap, and she waited. The Volkai went still. Its plates were still amber, but the cycling had slowed to something almost like resting rate. Its 6 limbs stayed on the floor. The sensory plates along its jaw were oriented toward Tove, reading her, Sen realized. Heartbeat, respiration, chemical output. The full picture of what a human sitting cross-legged on the floor smelled and sounded like when it wasn't afraid. Or more precisely, when it was working very hard at not being afraid and the effort was starting to show. Sen's skin had cycled to pale amber. She hadn't noticed until she looked down at her own hand. On's earpiece crackled. Sen could hear it on the security feed, tinny, clipped, a voice she didn't recognize. "Sub-commander." The subsonic organ on a category 9.2 is rated for structural interference at close range. If she stays on the floor. I know what it can do. Sir, the grid has 9 minutes. Protocol requires. I know what the protocol requires. On did not take his eyes off Tove. His lance was raised. His team was in position. The grid had 9 minutes and his finger was not moving, and the human on the floor was sliding a ration bar toward 800 kilos of death, and the scatter calculation, Sen could see him doing it. The slight shift in his eye line. The scatter calculation was complicated by the fact that the target mass and the human mass were currently along the same vector. He would have to wait for her to move. She showed no sign of moving. The Voakai took one step. The whole corridor seemed to adjust. On's team shifted weight, an involuntary ripple they held position, but the ripple moved through them like wind through grass. The one step brought the creature close enough that Tove could have reached out and touched it if she'd extended her arm. She didn't extend her arm. She sat with her hands in her lap and breathed. Sen could see her chest moving, in and out, steady. Not slow for calm, but slow for deliberate. The way you breathe when you are teaching your own lungs what this moment should feel like. Recycled air in the corridor. Metal warmth from the charged lances, sharp and faint at the same time, the smell of power running through a system under load. The emergency strips painting everything in low red. The Voakai stopped, 1 meter from Tove's knee. Its head was down. Not fully, not the complete plate lowering of submission, but a partial drop. The head tilted slightly below the baseline of its shoulder plane. Sen had a cellular biology practicum that covered threat displays in armored xenofauna, and she did not know what this was. It was not in the practicum. On's earpiece crackled again. He didn't answer it. 6 minutes on the grid. Tove opened her mouth, and she spoke to the Voakai. Not loudly. Low and even, the words less important than the sound, though the words were not nothing. They were plain words, short ones. Sen could make out fragments through the emergency panel. I know you were talking. And 6 days, I could hear it the whole time. And something else she couldn't parse, something about intervals, about patterns, about the difference between noise and language. The Voakai's plates were moving, not the fast amber cycle of alert. Something slower, starting at the base of the chest, moving outward in a wave. Sen watched it the way she watched everything, with the part of her brain that was still a first-year xenobiology cadet who had memorized the taxonomy, and the color coming up through those plates was not amber. It was indigo. Deep and slow and even, cycling up from the center of the creature's chest and spreading outward to the edge of each plate, and Sen's brain went to the footnote before she could stop it. The footnote was in Chapter 7 of the field guide, half a page, flagged as behavioral notation, insufficient data for primary classification. She had read it twice because the professor had said it probably wouldn't be on the exam. Indigo plate state in Voakai specimens has been documented in fewer than 12 field observations. Current hypothesis. A cessation of active threat assessment. The specimen has, for reasons not yet understood, decided the proximate entity is not a danger. 12 observations. In the history of recorded contact with the species. Tove was still talking, low and even. Her hands were in her lap. The Voakai's plates were indigo from edge to edge. Sen looked down at her own hand. Her skin had gone gold. She hadn't done it on purpose. Pelian chromatophores didn't work that way. You couldn't choose the color any more than you could choose your own heartbeat. Gold was the color her skin produced when something was happening that her body understood before her mind did. Something large, something she didn't have a word for yet. The grid voice came through the intercom. 6 minutes. Tove had not moved from the floor. The ration bar was still in front of her, 3 inches forward, foil catching the red light. On's team had not moved. The lances were still raised. The scatter calculation was still wrong. Sen pressed her back against the panel and her hand flat against its surface, and she felt, through the composite, very faint and very low, the first trace of a sound she hadn't heard yet. 1722. The sound came through the wall like a held note. Not loud, not sharp. It moved through the composite panel and into Sen's palm and up her arm and settled somewhere in her chest, and it did not stop. The Voakai's subsonic organ, active for the first time since the alarm had fired, running a frequency that was mostly below hearing and entirely in the body. The wall panels buzzed. The emergency strips flickered once. On the broadcast feed, Sen found out later, 40 million people heard it as a low wash of static, and the commentary desk went quiet. Sen pressed her hand flat against the panel and felt the question, because that was what it was. She understood that now in the place where the sound lived below her ribs. Not a threat display, not structural interference. Something with a shape to it, a pattern, the same intervals she had noticed in the behavioral log data without knowing what she was noticing. 6 days of signals, 6 days of data. 6 days the station had logged as a problem instead of a message. The Voakai had been asking something for almost a week. On's earpiece crackled, and he didn't answer it. His team had not moved. The lances were still raised. The grid read 4 minutes and some number of seconds that Sen couldn't see from her angle, and the sound was still running through the floor and the walls and the chest of every living thing in the corridor. Tove had not moved. Her hands were in her lap. The ration bar was 3 inches in front of her on the floor. 4 more steps. The Voakai moved with a slowness that seemed like a choice. Each limb placed carefully, weight shifted in stages, nothing sudden. 1 step. 2. The head came down lower. 3 steps. The sensor plates along its jaw were angled toward Tove's face, reading everything, and the hum deepened as it moved, rising slightly in frequency, and Sen understood without the taxonomy that the question was getting more specific. 4 steps. The creature stopped with its head 2 handspans from Tove's knee. Tove breathed in, breathed out. She said quietly to the animal, "I know." 30 seconds passed. Sen counted them. She did not mean to count them, but her mind needed somewhere to go, and it went there, ticking off seconds while the hum moved through the walls, and On stood with his lance raised, and his finger still, and the grid ran down, and nobody in the corridor made a sound. At the 30-second mark, Tove raised her right hand. Slow, slower than slow. The kind of movement that took that long on purpose, that said, "Here is my hand. Here is what it is doing. Here is where it is going. No surprises, no sudden anything." She brought it up from her lap and moved it forward, and she placed it on the jaw of the Voakai. The sensor plates were warm. Sen couldn't feel them from behind the panel, but she knew from the taxonomy, and she filed it as knowledge instead of experience, and her skin was blazing gold, and she was not moving. The hum deepened. Not louder, deeper. A different note lower, the kind of low that was less sound than pressure, and the wall panels stopped buzzing, and the emergency strips held steady, and the sound settled into something that did not have a word for it in the field guide or the practicum notes or any document Sen had read in her first year at this academy. She was crying. She noticed this the way she noticed her skin had gone gold, after the fact, as information. Her face was wet. She hadn't chosen it. Her chromatophores didn't choose gold either. Her body was a set of honest instruments, and the instruments were all reading the same thing. Her skin was the deep, slow blue she had not produced since she was 6 years old, sitting in a field on Pelion home ground watching something she didn't have words for, and she had not expected to produce it again for a long time. The grid reached 11 seconds. Sen heard it in the intercom voice. Calm. Institutional. 11. Same voice as meal rotations and shuttle departures and the opening of a ceremony 40 million people were watching in the atrium while this corridor existed in the same station, the same moment, the same 14 minutes. 9. On's jaw was set. 7. His finger was not moving. The scatter calculation had not changed. Target mass and human mass still along the same vector, still unresolvable, still the same equation it had been for the last 9 minutes. He knew this. Sen could see in the line of his shoulders that he knew this, and that knowing it was not the same as being at peace with it. 5. The Voakai's plates were indigo from edge to edge, deep and slow and steady, the footnote color, the decided color. 3. Tove's hand was still on its jaw. 2. She did not move. 1. On gave the advance order. Protocol, Sen heard it in his earpiece, clipped and procedural, the way every order he had ever given in 22 years had sounded. Advance. Formation Delta, lethal resolution on contact. His team moved 3 steps. Clean and coordinated the way they always moved. 1 organism, 6 lances, the full weight of what the protocol was designed to do. Tove was on her feet before the 3rd step. Sen did not see her stand. She was there and then she was standing, the way some movements happen fast enough that the eye registers only the before and the after. 1 moment on the floor, 1 moment upright, between the officers and the Voakai with her hands at her shoulders, open, palms forward. Stop. She didn't shout it. She didn't need to shout it. It landed in the corridor with the weight of a physical thing, a word that took up space, and On's team stopped. Not because she had authority, Sen knew she had none, but because the scatter calculation had just gotten worse. The human was now directly in the engagement path, and the angle of the lances would put energy through her and into the target and beyond, and the corridor walls were not rated for that scatter. And the compliance officer's voice in every Ruthian field manual said clearly, "Do not fire through a civilian." On raised his fist, hold. His team held. Behind Tove, the Vorkai rose to full height, all 6 limbs on the floor, upright, the full 800 kilos of it filling the space above her, plates deep indigo, the subsonic hum still running at the low, settled note it had found when her hand touched its jaw. It looked at On's team. It did not move toward them. It watched them. We did not conquer them. We did not cage them. We sat down on the ground next to them and let them decide. The thought would come to Sen later, reading the transcript. Those were not the exact words Tove used. Not in that order, not yet. The exact words were still 40 seconds away, while On stood with his lance raised and the grid read 0 and nobody in the corridor had breathed for what felt like a long time. On the broadcast feed, Director Carroll had not moved since the alarm fired. He was still at the podium. The ceremony had stopped being a ceremony approximately 13 minutes ago. His secondary arm was at his side, and his Coleridge nodes had gone dark, full cognitive load, the Orvathi equivalent of every system running at once. 40 million viewers were watching a feed that had split. The atrium on one side, the corridor security camera on the other. He was watching Tove. His secondary arm was near the override panel. Tove looked at On for a long moment. Then she said, in the same plain, flat voice she had used for everything in this corridor, the same voice she had used for the Vorkai. She passed 19 personnel in this station this morning. 19. Not one of them was harmed. The number dropped into the corridor. Check your own footage. On did not move. The behavioral log says 31 days of agitation. Run the frequency data. 6 days of it was intervals, the same timing, the same pattern. Her voice carried no heat, just statement. Plain statement, the way you'd read a number off a gauge. The query was never run. The data was there. She stopped, looked at On's lance, then back at his face. I have been doing this for 11 years, she said. Before that, other people were doing it for 10,000. We are not the strongest species on our planet. We were never the strongest species. We could not outrun the things that hunted us or outfight them or outarmor them. A breath. We sat down on the ground next to them instead, in the dirt, with our hands where they could see, and we waited for them to decide. The Vorkai had not moved. 19 unarmed personnel this morning in this corridor. 19. The repetition was the only time anything in her voice shifted. Just barely, controlled, but the seam showed. One of them was a first-year cadet behind an emergency panel in Section 4. Ask her what she saw. Sen's skin was deep blue. She was not hiding it. On the broadcast feed, Director Carroll's secondary arm moved. The override panel was designed for one function: suspend the automatic lethal resolution protocol and return authority to the commanding officer on site. It required a director-level authorization. It had been used 4 times in the Academy's history. Carroll pressed it. The turrets powered down. The grid voice said, protocol suspended. Override active. Commanding officer has authority, in the same calm institutional tone it used for meal rotations. And then the corridor was quiet except for the Vorkai's hum, low and settled, and Tove's breathing, and somewhere behind an emergency panel, a first-year xenobiology cadet who had stopped counting seconds. On stood with his lance in his hands. He looked at Tove. He looked at the Vorkai. He looked at the lance. He set it against the wall. He didn't speak. He stood there for a moment, the worn groove in the grip from 22 years of field carry pressed against nothing. And then he stepped back, and his team stepped back, and the corridor held that shape for a long time before anyone moved. The juveniles were in storage bay on 7, cataloged under specimen reference 7741C and 7741D, filed as unrelated specimens. Different intake date, different researcher, different section of the log. The query linking their biometric markers to the adult in searing had never been run. They were the size of large dogs. Their plates were translucent, bioluminescence not yet calibrated, still cycling through colors without pattern, the way young things did before they learned to mean anything. 2 of them, pressing against the bay door. The duty officer opened it at 10:23. The Vorkai did not move until Tove stepped aside. Then it moved, and the word gentleness was inadequate, but it was the closest word available. The way it lowered its head, the way its limbs arranged themselves around the 2 small bodies, the way the hum changed register entirely, rising into something above the subsonic range, something that could be heard with ears and not just bones. Sen was standing in the open corridor. She was not behind the panel. She was standing in the middle of searing with her arms at her sides and her skin the deep blue that meant something she did not have words for yet. And she was not hiding it, and she did not try. On filed the after-action report 14 hours later. It was not the report the protocol expected. The protocol expected a fatality event summary and a specimen disposal confirmation and a recommendation for revised containment procedures. What on wrote was something else. 34 fatalities over 43 years. He had reviewed the incident files before, but not with this question in mind. The question was new. 31 of the 31, were linked to researcher approach vectors. The angle, the speed, the posture of the person who had walked into the containment zone. The common thread in 31 deaths was not the animal. It was how the person had moved toward it. The question nobody survived long enough to answer. The number 31 sat differently now than it had in the behavioral log. Same number, different weight. On filed the report and went home and did not sleep for most of the night, which was a thing that happened to him sometimes, and which he dealt with the same way he dealt with everything, by waiting for it to pass. Director Carroll called the emergency session 4 days later. 212 species. The broadcast had reached 1.4 billion replays in 24 hours, not the ceremony, which had been the most-watched orbital event in 53 years, but the corridor feed, the security camera, the angle that showed a human sitting, cross-legged on a beige floor with her hands in her lap. The Orvathi had a word for an image that changed what came after. Sen looked it up later. It translated roughly as the picture that teaches, and it applied specifically to images that could not be unseen, not because they were disturbing, but because they rearranged something in the mind of the person who saw them. Something about what was possible. Something about what had always been possible and had simply not been tried. Carroll's session ran for 9 hours. The protocol that had governed Academy containment procedures for 43 years was suspended pending full review. An emergency standards working group was convened. It had 41 members. Tove was asked to chair the Behavioral Assessment Subcommittee. She accepted. She had never found Bay 7 connector. She didn't leave. The sanctuary took 8 weeks to build. The nesting architecture came from Homeworld cave surveys. Low ceilings in the inner chamber, specific rock face angles, thermal gradients matching the natural habitat within 2 degrees. The xenobiology department contributed 3 graduate students and a materials specialist. Tove contributed 11 years of field notes and a very specific opinion about the dimensions of the inner threshold. The observation room had a glass wall, floor to ceiling, and chairs. The first practicum session was the week after the sanctuary opened. First-year cadets sitting in a row with notebooks, watching what the animals chose to do when no one was trying to stop them. The assignment was simple: observe and record. No hypotheses, no intervention, just watching. Sen was first in line every morning. She had filed her incident report the day after, a first-year cadet's account, 12 pages, the kind of document that was supposed to be administrative and had turned out to be something else, cited in 7 of the 41 working group submissions. Her skin stayed blue for 3 days after the corridor. Not always, not in class, not at meals. But when she sat down at the observation glass and opened her notebook, it came back without her choosing it, and she stopped trying to make it go away. On attended one of the practicum sessions 6 weeks in. He sat in the back. He did not take notes. He watched the 2 juveniles pressing their plates against the glass at feeding time, and he did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, to no one in particular, 31. Nobody asked him what he meant. Some of them knew. Some of them would look it up later. The ration bar was still in the corner of the observation room. Tove had set it down the day the sanctuary opened, not placed it, not displayed it, just set it in the corner near the base of the wall the way you'd set something down when your hands were full and you needed them free. It was still in its foil. The caloric stamp was in the upper left corner. The supply code was still legible. By the 2nd week, no one moved it. By the 3rd week, no one thought about moving it. It had simply become part of the room, the way certain things do when they have been somewhere long enough. Not a monument, not a symbol, just a thing that belonged there now. The juveniles pressed their translucent plates against the glass when Tove walked by. Their mother stood behind them, watching, not with the amber of alert, not with the deep, slow indigo of a decision still being made. Something quieter than that.